and welcome to our webinar, our live stream here. I see folks rolling in. So great to have you all here. We're going to give folks a few minutes to join us in this jam today. So while we're getting everybody into our session, go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. You can let us know your name and what type of storytelling that you're doing most often. So my name is Katie Chambers. I'll be our host today. I'm from Figma. I'm our FigJam advocate here, and I am often doing storytelling to convince people of my great ideas, to get them on board with the things that I am hoping to run with. And we also have Jory and Noah here. We'll be introducing them more formally in a minute, but Jory, what about you? Is there a common type of storytelling you're doing on a day-to-day basis?
Putting me on the spot.
I am.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess when we're Noah and I are both icon designers, so
Yeah.
what is an icon if not a little story, right? So
Hey, I love
we do
that.
visual storytelling.
Through your work. I love that. Wonderful. We have some things rolling in from the chat here. We have Andrew is telling stories to present research results. Love that. We have Natalia. We have Jauza joining us. Oh, from Indonesia. We appreciate you being here in the middle of the night. Thank you for being here. Noah, what about you? What's a common form of storytelling that you are doing?
Jory took what I was going to say, so I'll say something I do more in my spare time, which is tabletop role-playing games is actually a big, which is a fun way to do collaborative storytelling and a little more off-the-cuff type stuff. So that's about every week if I'm lucky, or every 2 weeks we can do that sort of thing.
I wonder where you got your mad storytelling skills from, and now
we know.
Yeah,
World of Fantasy.
World of Fantasy. Love it. Awesome. We have lots coming in from the chat here. We have some of my favorite friends, Mal and Miggy, joining us. We have Jerry from Chicago, who's doing storytelling for brands. Luis from Brazil is joining us in the afternoon there. We have Aiko from Japan. Look, we have folks from all over the world joining us. Thank you so much for being here, for coming to learn about storytelling. We have Kelly, who's using storytelling to craft compelling copy. So all different applications of storytelling, all different places in the world that we have folks joining from, and we are so delighted that you are here today. With that, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn off our tunes here, and we're going to dig in. So welcome everyone to this live stream webinar. We are in the file today learning about how Jory and Noah used FigJam and Figma to craft an awesome story from sketches to slides. So we're going to dig in and learn all about what that means and how they did that. A few logistics before we dig in. The perennial question we always get, will the session be recorded? The answer is yes. The session is being recorded and it will be made available on our YouTube channel. So check out Figma Design YouTube channel and you'll find this recording in the next few days there. We have a Q&A form that you can use to answer questions. So I'm putting that in the chat right now. If you want to ask questions through that form, those will come right onto the board that you're seeing us here, and I'll bring this back up at the end. You can also go ahead and use that Q&A button in Zoom, and Vanessa and myself will be keeping an eye on that and bringing those questions in here. So we're going to have lots of time for Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions for Jory and Noah about their storytelling practices or about anything that they're covering today, feel free to use that form, use the Q&A, and we will bring those into this discussion at the end. You can also use chat, but a quick reminder to chat to everyone. It's sometimes defaulted to hosts and panelists. Just switch that over to everyone. That way we can all have a conversation together. We have hundreds of folks here today, and we want to bring you into the conversation. So you can use chat to do that. And we have our wonderful friend, Vanessa, who's monitoring and helping us out with the chat today as well. So you'll be seeing her in there as well. And lastly, given that we do have hundreds of folks here in the file, we might be bringing you into this FigJam file live at the end. If it seems feasible, we ask that you be respectful when you do that. So both in the chat and also here in the FigJam file, please be kind, be respectful to our other friends that we have joining us and jamming with us today. And you can see our code of conduct at figma.com/code-of-conduct. And please follow all the rules there during today's live stream. With that, all our housekeeping out of the way, I am so delighted to be joined by Jory and Noah here. So I had the opportunity to meet Jory at a speaker event for Config last year, and I told him I was a FigJam advocate. We started digging in, and he was telling me how he used FigJam for putting together his Config talk. And immediately I was like, that's awesome. We need to tell this story. And it took a while for me to get on it, but I finally got in touch with Jory, and asked him if he could share some of his storytelling practices and what that process looked like for collaborative storytelling with him and Noah. So I'm delighted today to have Jory Raphael, make sure I got that right, and Noah Jacobus joining us here from the Font Awesome team to share their storytelling practices. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Jory and let them take it away.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Noah, I think you're going to share your screen here.
Right.
So as Katie said, we're going to walk you through and try and be quick with this, but walk you through how we created our presentation for last year's Figma conference, which is that's a mouthful. Config Figma conference. But before we get started, I did just want to say that although a lot of the examples we're going to share today are specific to FigJam and Figma and the presentation we made for Config, our hope here is that the takeaways are extensible to any type of storytelling or any presentation you're putting together. And also another slight warning that we're going to get a little meta here because we are using FigJam to show you how we used FigJam to create a presentation. So it may loop back in on itself a few times. So bear with us as we move through that. But so what you're seeing here on the screen is the FigJam file that we put together for this talk today, the screencast that we're doing. And you can see we've loosely, I'll zoom in a little bit here. We've loosely broken it down into sections. So we are currently in this section right here, the introducing the thing section. And then we're going to move on to planning. We're going to move on to making the thing that Noah's going to take over there, honing the thing, doing the thing, and then finally at the end here, some Q&A if anyone is interested or has further questions on things. Now, this structure that we're using here for this FigJam file itself is very similar to the structure that we use in general for our config presentation and kind of our storytelling process, which is breaking things down into a planning phase, a making phase, a honing phase, and then a doing phase. And as you see in this little chart here, there's some overlap between these sections. In planning, there's this overlap between idea and building out the initial flow and the structure. Making has that overlap between creation and the flow and structure, honing and doing, et cetera, et cetera. So with that in mind, we're going to jump into our config talk and show you how we built it. So the very first thing, moving over here, is planning the thing. So in the context of config, the very first thing we did was we needed to decide to submit a talk, right? That was the first step. I think that was a pretty good first step, right, Noah? Deciding to...
I guess if you had to pick one, yeah.
So we decided we wanted to do a talk, but then the question was, what should the talk be about? And so we asked ourselves the question, what do we have to share that might be interesting to others? What do we do that is unique to us here at Font Awesome, but that has broader application outside of our particular circumstances? So backing up a little bit, at its core, at Font Awesome, we make icons, but we do it in Figma. And not only that, but we make a lot of icons. So we started to think that maybe our talk is not just about icon design on the whole, but instead more about how we've systematized our icon design and the tools we use to do. So we started with a very rough outline with that as the kernel of truth here. And I'm going to zoom in to this sessionized screenshot here. This is the tool that Figma uses for the config application process. And a little side note here is actually fun that Sessionize uses some Font Awesome icons. So that was fun to see when we were submitting this. But we started with a very rough breakdown of an outline here. And you can see it at the bottom. We had a little introduction, very roughly how to manage icons and how to build icons. And you'll see a little bit later that we did follow this a little bit. We moved some things around, restructured it, all as part of our process. But what we found helpful here was that we broke things down into timed sections. And that was actually really helpful for us at the beginning because it gave us some constraints that we could work from. And at least for me, a time limit was a good thing because I don't know if you noticed, but in here, like this little, I threw in 5 minutes here. Each of our little sections is generally timed out. And that takes a little bit of pressure away because planning a 40-minute talk can be daunting. You don't know how do you fill out that time. But if you've already broken it down to sections, like I could talk for 5 minutes about just about anything. Now, I may not know what I'm talking about, but I could do it. So that's a little easier. So we did that for this very presentation right here. We broke it into these little 5-minute chunks that we're going to walk through. And after that, so after we did our initial outline, and sorry that I'm jumping around so much if you're getting whiplash, I apologize. But after we did the initial outline here, we moved on to a brainstorming session. And for brainstorming, we stepped away from the computer entirely. And I actually took pen and literal paper, went outside, sat on my deck, and started using the outline as a guideline, started just a stream of consciousness of, pardon the term, but vomiting ideas out. And so these are the actual photo of some of the notes I took during the planning phase here, the stream of consciousness phase. And that really just allowed us to, I don't know, explore nooks and crannies and all like the corners of the subject that we want to discuss. And as part of, there's no judgment as part of the brainstorming process. You just throw ideas out. Some are going to work, some aren't. But what you ultimately start to do is you start to build up some connective tissue and develop some story beats. If you can see here, like there's a little, I wrote a little 1 here and a 1A, and I've drawn arrows from one place to another place. And there's figuring out how this story could start to work and if we're covering everything we need to cover. And then after that, we took all of those notes and moved into FigJam. And here's a little screenshot of FigJam. And actually, Noah, I'm going to jump over into the config talk or the brainstorm file here. So this is the actual file we used for config. These are all of our notes, and this is where we ended up. But when we started it, it was just a bunch of yellow sticky notes. We had typed up all the notes we had taken on a pencil and paper there. And what's helpful for me is I started to think of these notes as like puzzle pieces that you could move around and group into sections. Noah and I, you can see we left each other a lot of little notes here and questions. And ultimately, we just started building out the first phase of our talk flow here, and which then ultimately moves us back into the making part of the process. So I'm going to jump back over here to the outline, and I'm going to pass it off to Noah.
Yes, making the thing once we got to this stage. And I do have some notes here, but I'll primarily hop back over here to talk about this stage of things. So as Jory mentioned, when we had reached that phase of organizing a lot of this content into FigJam, stuff started to fall nicely into some of these general buckets. We knew we would need an intro and an outro, but as far as the arrangement of some of this other content, we started filing them under these general headings. Something that would allow us to progressively build on information, kind of starting high level and diving deep, and then resurfacing back up with some of these processes and learnings. And it also made a lot of sense to use these buckets to help give each other a break during the presentation. Back and forth and banter and that kind of stuff works for areas like introductions and stuff like that. But for all of these more nitty-gritty pieces, like talking about components and variants and systems, it made sense for either Jory or me to have kind of our own sections. So we demarked that with little versions of our faces that we also ended up partly reusing in the presentation itself. But this has the added benefit of not only, breaking up the content, but making it easier for our camera operators at the presentation itself, who are going to be filming and streaming the whole thing, so they wouldn't have to be constantly switching between feeds or keeping us both up together in a mid or a wide shot the entire time. Excuse me. But as we were going through, as Jory mentioned, and filling out these buckets and starting to develop some kind of a connective tissue between all these things, we realized that we might need to take a step back from just jumping straight into the nitty-gritty. So we did add in a little section as an amuse-bouche, if you will, to set the stage around icons themselves and some of the constraints around iconography. We realized we needed kind of an introduction section. And part of that kind of came from some advice that our assigned designer advocate, Miggy, who I think is in the chat, shout out to Miggy, who was an immense help to us. One thing he mentioned was that what's obvious for us, who are in this kind of work all day, every day, isn't going to be obvious to everybody else. So we decided to reframe and talking about some very high level icon things that would then come into play later. because icons in and of themselves are little systems. And so that are tied into the meat of what we wanted to talk about. Now, all of these buckets, all of these kind of content silos are really great, but these bits on their own aren't going to be super compelling. So we had to think about what is going to keep people in their seats and listening to us for 40 minutes. And more importantly, what do we want folks to get out of it? And that's where we started kind of a new range of sticky notes that weren't just content ideas, but we wanted to start building out some connective tissue. So something we started working on were things like takeaways, little golden nuggets that people would want to think about. And another thing that Mickey had mentioned to us in terms of thinking about story was when you have a sense of scale, that scale can help tell a story. And we have the name 30,000 icons. It was right in the name. And that's a pretty massive scale. So a narrative thread kind of began to appear, focused on how Figma helped save us time and sanity, kind of wrangling a giant icon library. And it could connect kind of everything from basics to processes and management and Figma specific stuff that we were using. And so that got us to lay out some story beats from very specific work we've done at Phonos in the last couple of years. For example, some of these story beats here where we talked about working on very specific styles and things we needed to do when we were exporting these giant libraries, things we needed to think about when I came on board and we started having multiple designers working on things and how we were going to handle all of those kinds of changes. And so this led to these nice kind of blue stickies that we added at the top of different sections to make sure that we had some of that narrative connective tissue in mind at the top of each of these sections to make sure they all made sense together. And of course, as a wrap up to all of these things, we wanted to reinforce them with some sort of takeaway or some sort of really sticky information to help people. And so we started color coding with another little section with some extra stickies to keep in mind things that really ensure that these things wouldn't get lost in the shuffle as we went. And the key part of this process, and really the whole thing, was to get enough of this content in good shape to reinforce that time-saving story. If we're going to be trying to really polish everything up at every single phase, that's definitely not saving us time. So we didn't want to write the entire presentation on stickies in FigJam, much as we love FigJam. It's fantastic. But once we got an idea of the general shape and these buckets of content, it was time to get visual. And for that, we moved over to Figma, and I'm going to do the same. This is the Figma file that we actually use to start planning out all of our visuals for the slides themselves. And as you can see, we have a page over here called Scratch. This is the island of misfit slides, a lot of dumping ground of different things that didn't work or just was in process. And so we started in one corner thinking about, okay, we know we're going to need a cover slide, and Figma already had a great template for that. What could we do with that? Thinking about potentially grid systems that we might want to use to work on visual density, just to give ourselves an idea of some constraints for ourselves, some base level components like our lovely faces, logos, things we wanted to set up with slides. And I'll get to some of the rest of this in a second, but that helped us set the stage. As you can see here, let me hide some of the controls, was to start developing those same content silos, or not silos, the columns in FigJam that we set up. We were able to translate a lot of that into kind of these horizontal lanes of topics that we were able to color code as well. So we could think about, oh, this is a nice for introduction, and start talking about icon constraints, Booleans and variants, and then talking about systems and a wrap up. And we were able to translate that a lot into this nice kind of format here, as you can see. And we even started thinking about some early high level places where we could include animation and some of that stuff, which is actually still in place on our Scratch page. You can see some very early stuff that we knew that we wanted to be animated around key shapes. We have some of that in there, as well as some stuff that Jory will talk about in a second that we used at the next phase. But we were able to start blocking a lot of this out at a very early stage. And that helped us by serving not only as a touch point for what we wanted to achieve in the final thing, but also as a kind of storyboard. so that even though a lot of these things are pretty rough and placeholder, we could start practicing our narrative pacing and our quote unquote stage presence as much as you can do when you're sitting at your desk in sweatpants. But helpful first step for what Jory's going to get into next.
Okay, so I'm not wearing sweatpants right now, Noah, but I do have slippers on.
That's close enough.
Yeah. All right, so moving on, honing the thing. This was what's interesting, I think, about our process so far, and I don't know if you've picked up on this at all, is that from each of our steps, as we've moved from the initial outline to the note taking to FigJam to Figma, and then ultimately as we are moving on to the next phases of it, the process is like a filter. So it all gives us a chance to further refine things and ultimately sculpt the presentation. And there are things that were showing up in that initial brainstorming doc that were like, great. There were solid little nuggets of gold that we ended up losing. We ended up dropping. They didn't have a place, and that's okay. Nothing really was precious about this. So the idea is you get as much out as you can, and then as you're going through the process, you sculpt things and you get rid of what doesn't work and you refine things. There were some really good jokes there that I'm sad we didn't get into the document. And looking at those slides in the Figma file, there are slides that we just ultimately didn't do. So as Noah said, Figma kind of ultimately became the rough draft of our presentation, and where we started doing the illustrations and moving through the whole process. It was the Scratch file that we used for not only the visuals to begin with, but those animations. And so right here is an example of one of those animations that we created to use. We ultimately moved to Keynote for the presentation itself, because that was one of the requirements at Config, but we used Figma as much as we could. So in this case, these were a bunch of slides that I put together that utilized Figma's prototyping features and Smart Animate from slide to slide, where I was showing the process we use to typically create an icon. And so I animated this in Figma and then took a screen recording of the prototype and used that screen recording in the keynote presentation itself, which is fun. And here's another example here. No, I think you might have to play that. Yeah, so this is one Noah created using Smart Animate as well. And let me just get my thing back up here. Okay, and then because we knew the final presentation was going to be in Keynote, that's where we ultimately moved to create the final version of all of our slides. Now, I just want to say that if you are using Figma to do a presentation, just stay there. Or if in the case of this project right here, we are using FigJam for this presentation, so we're mainly staying in FigJam. Use the tool that works for you or for the process that you're in. We moved to Keynote, and at this point in the process, I'm going to scan back over here to, we are at the refinement phase of things, which meant rehearsal, because a presentation isn't actually a presentation if you don't present it. That may seem obvious, but actually seeing and hearing how the topic sounded and looked versus not just as slides was super, super helpful for us. As we moved through this process, we started building out these slides in Keynote, and I will say that we used a shared Keynote file via iCloud so that both Noah and I could be in the same file itself and leave each other notes. And then you can, zooming in even farther on this little example here, you can see we divided things up into sections that were all collapsible so that you focus on the individual section you were working on one at a time. And as we started rehearsing the presentation, there were just all sorts of discoveries to be made, which was fun. But this was, I don't know, hard part in the process, because I think that I'll say starting the rehearsal was the hard part, because the first time you turn the camera on and record yourself presenting something, to be honest, it feels very awkward. But if you can get to the point where you sound natural and can make jokes when speaking to an empty room, like by yourself, you'll probably be okay on stage. And another thing here that was actually helpful about this Keynote process is that we were able to leave ourselves presenter notes. And I'll say that Noah and I both had different styles in how we wrote our notes out, but this is an example of one of the slides I did. And at the bottom here, you can see I left myself just these little bullet points. And I'll say that by having the notes in place, it was almost, we needed them less. It was just knowing that cushion was there if we needed it was very helpful, that little cheat sheet. But for example, I think I'm gonna I'm trying this off the cuff, so we'll see if I'm able to actually remember what I said per se. But I think moving into this section, I said something like, "I'm not a mathematician. Who is this guy?" This is Mr. George Boole. He was an English mathematician who in 1854 laid the groundwork for Boolean logic or binary logic, which is the foundation of modern computing as we know it today. Now, Boolean logic is founded on the principles of yes or no, true or false, George Boole or George Cool, at which point the sunglasses slid onto his face there. So
it made the whole presentation.
yeah,
honestly.
that was it. We could have stopped after that. So these are little notes we left for ourselves. But to actually rehearse the presentation, we worked in little smaller story beats. So for example, this on the sidebar here, this like the intro section or the little yellow section here, or even just the pink section here where I'm talking about Boolean groups, like we kind of work through that section one at a time. And Noah and I used Loom for that. And now you don't have to use Loom, but I would suggest something that can capture both your screen and your webcam at the same time is super helpful. And I'll also say that although sometimes we recorded things for each other sitting down, actually standing up and presenting to an empty room was helpful. But we would do these recordings of these little sections, share them back and forth with each other. We'd leave comments, or you could even leave your own comment like, oh, this section is a little rough for me. I'm going to change it to this. Or you'll start to notice when you have little visual tics on certain things. But I'll also say, and I know this isn't true for everyone doing a presentation, but it was such a boon and benefit to have a partner during this whole process. Even for this talk today, having Noah on with me at the same time was helpful because beyond just collaboration, it means you have a backup plan. And it was helpful for me, at least, to have, if I mess up, I know that Noah can fill in the gaps or help me out. If I ask him for help, he's going to be, Noah, you're such a warm blanket. And just having you off on the side there is just, it's a cushion that I know I can land on if I need to. But what I also, which is super funny, and I don't know if anyone else has this experience, but when I was rehearsing my sections, I found that I had a phantom co-host where I would, during particular moments of the rehearsal, I would look off to my right and start talking to Noah as if he were standing there. And it was a way to, I don't know, it helped sculpt the presentation a little bit more when you're not just talking to an audience, knowing that, oh, here's an out. I can talk to Noah and ask him a question and kind of maybe he can answer one. That was really fun and helpful. After we rehearsed it multiple times, it got easier every single time we did it, I'll say. And you can actually see up right here is Noah. Every now and then we would record and time ourselves to see how each section was timing out to make sure we weren't going over our time or too far under our time. And then the final thing I'll say is that, which is this little note here, is to not stop if you stumble. And this was something that Miggy actually helped us with a lot, which was just like, just muscle through it. Just keep going. If you trip up on something, move on to the next thing. Because if you focus too much on that one moment, you're going to keep looping back in on yourself over and over again. I have messed up so many times during this presentation today already, but I'm just going to continue to move forward. And that actually moving forward, we're going to move on now to the doing part of the process. And I will hand the keys back over to Mr. Jacobus.
Yes, doing. I didn't know that you'd messed up because you kept going. I didn't even think about it.
Right?
Yes, so doing the thing from keynote to everyone's eyeballs. The time for config was swiftly approaching at this stage of things in the refinement process, and before we knew it, we were whisked away to San Francisco for a whole week of prep, which was not something I thought we would need. It seemed like an absurdly long time for a 2-day conference, but it turns out we did need all of that time. So we got to the Figma office early in the week. We got to hobnob with a lot of speakers and online friends, both old and new Figma folks. Fantastic way to start everything off. But more importantly, we got to run through our whole presentation again, top front to back with Miggy. There he is, with an in-person audience for the first time. Of course, Jory and I had been rehearsing, and we'd also been doing calls with Miggy, but actually having a person in physical proximity listening to you for the first time is a wild adrenaline rush. And it immediately set us more at ease having done that really early in the week, while also surfacing some really great things to work on and keep in mind. Things like even standing at desks like we've done before, things when you're just freestanding with no support, things to think about, not locking your knees, or trying to have more natural hand gestures and not appear too wooden or bound up. Things like not rocking back and forth or swaying too much, which is something I discovered that I do when I'm nervous, that's tough to remember when you're in a new context and you've had things like a desk or a chair or whatever, more physical things to ground you up to that point. And we were also able to help iron out some transitions and timing, and because we don't have video delay that we've been working with and stuff like that. So figuring out the timing and the beats of that. And the next day, we were able to do a full dry run with tech in the actual room where we'd be presenting for the conference. So we got to work on mics and full screen presentation, stage blocking, an actual introduction from somebody from Figma, and the whole works. We double checked our slides with our excellent stage manager and the tech team and felt good to go. And just personally, I'm very grateful that we had those check-ins before the conference, because not only was it really good to get a feel for speaking in new contexts, but it gave us kind of some relief from the waves of nervousness that would come and go throughout the week. So it'd be being able to have something distracting, like a fun time with other speakers, then you'd start getting really nervous and in your own head, and you'd have a rehearsal and smooth that out. And so the cadence that had been set up throughout the week really helped us not build all that tension up too much. We had some release valves that definitely helped. And this is us on stage, looking like we know what we're doing.
No, that is literally the moment I just did on my slide where I talked about George Boole. This is literally the moment before it. I'm pointing at myself and I'm saying, now I'm not a mathematician, but you know who that is?
This is the face of a mathematician.
No, that is not a mathematician.
So actually the conference and giving the talk was an absolute blast. For any of you who were able to be there, either virtually or in person, I hope you could pick up on that energy. And our talk went off mostly without a hitch. It's always good to have some backup tech ready to go. In our case, a remote for the slides. So having practiced some of that phantom co-host and banter stuff came in handy, where you can vamp for a minute if you need to, but it all worked out really well. And if you weren't able to see this for any reason, it is on YouTube. And you should watch it. Not now. Wait for this to wrap up and then go watch it. It's a good time. So after Jory and Katie met up and got a conversation going, and then Katie called us up and asked us to do this, we were able to do this exact same process again, albeit on a much smaller and casual scale. And these were some notes we had written out, but it turns out that and we'll follow the line, it actually... we'll get there.
The long
ties
line.
All the way back in to this. This is what we had talked about at the beginning. This exact same process served us very well for building this talk. We were able to do the exact same process front to back, figuring out doing a big brain dump of ideas and finding common connections and threads between those things, trimming the fat, making it as polished, in our case, just as polished as it needs to be for this. This was not we didn't need something for config. We were able to be a little more casual and show you some stuff behind the scenes for this, just doing as much as you need to tell your story. All in all, considering both this talk and config, after we'd flown back home from that experience and we were able to process a lot of that, where did that leave us in terms of thinking about storytelling? And there were a few additional kind of golden nuggets that we came away with, some of which we've mentioned before. One of them, which is tough for me because I like to try to get things as polished as early as possible, but practice makes progress. Not the phrase that you've probably heard, practice makes perfect, because perfection is an illusion. And even the idea of it implies that at some point you can stop trying to improve. And the earlier that you can come to terms with that, the easier it is to digest and incorporate and appreciate slow incremental improvement. The anti-move fast and break things, I think, which I also don't really care for. But especially for somebody like me who not super comfortable with public speaking, knowing that if you keep chipping away at it, it will get there and it will be worthwhile, even if it's not amazing right out of the gate. And something that really helps with that is embracing constraints and limitations, something that we've talked about throughout this previously. And this is not just in crafting talks or presentations, but in most creative endeavors. It's incredibly useful. Jory mentioned there were a lot of things that we could have included in our talk, and we definitely considered it, both config and this one, that got trimmed out. Things that were in our initial pitch that just didn't make the cut because they didn't serve the story that we identified after that brain dump process, the narrative threads that we found that could connect everything. It just was extraneous. And also something Jory mentioned, especially during the rehearsal process, share your brain. It's true that some fantastic things can be made in isolation, one person off doing their own thing, but more and more we've found that Figma's own mantra is true, that nothing great is made alone. And if perfection really is an illusion and not really real, then there's no reason why you shouldn't get feedback on your work, design or otherwise, as early and often as it's beneficial. There is something to be said for being able to work on things a little bit yourself, but once things are ready to be worked on, get somebody else's take on it. We certainly wouldn't have had the great experience we did if it hadn't been for being able to sharpen each other's ideas with internal feedback and all of the really invaluable input that Miggy and other folks at Figma gave to us. In all, that is why FigJam and Figma are great tools to talk about FigJam and Figma. It did get meta. Because you don't have to go all out with an elaborate template or a fully polished prototype, variables, the whole 9 yards. You can do just enough to get your point across to tell an awesome story. And it's over.
So you'll see things here. If I think, are we going to share this file afterwards, Katie?
Yes.
Yeah, so you'll see things here that we wrote down that we actually didn't talk about today too. So that's just part of the process, but it goes into further how our minds were working through the problem and how we ultimately sculpted things and crafted things to get where we ended up. So that's it. That's our talk.
Yay. That's the first part of the talk. We have lots of questions, so don't go anywhere.
Okay.
We're not letting these two off the hook yet. We're also getting some great comments in the chat. Perfection is an illusion is something that John's going to put on a t-shirt, so we can all get one of those. Maybe we can wear them at config. We're getting lots of love, lots of excitement for everything that y'all have shared. And with that, we are going to move over to Q&A. I'm going to take back the screen share, Jory, if that's okay. So what I've been doing is I've been capturing I've been capturing the key points that I took away from the talk here in this file. We'll be sharing this out and the content you just saw Noah presenting with everyone via email tomorrow. So definitely do that. But I've also been getting questions from the forum that y'all have been submitting. So we're going to dig in now to some of these questions here. I'm also going to go ahead and share this FigJam file with everyone in the chat. So if you want to hop into this file and part the questions that you really want us to get to today, we probably won't have time for all of them, so you can help us prioritize what you want to hear Jory and Noah talk about from here. And I'm going to dig into some of the questions. You can also add new questions just by adding new stickies to our Q&A section here. I'm going to start with this question, Jory and Noah. Jory, you talked about how do you decide what to speak about in the first place, and you talked about finding something that was unique to you. What can you uniquely tell the audience that others might not be able to? How do you validate whether or not your idea is quote unquote good enough to share? Like, how do you find that right level of story to tell?
Oh, that's super interesting. One way to validate it, I don't know that this is the best way, but one way is we submitted our idea and it was accepted. Right. So that
there you go.
So that's one way. That's probably the easiest way. But I think that there were y'all can probably attest to this, that there were tons and tons of great ideas that were submitted that didn't make the cut for any number of reasons. And that's not to say that they weren't unique or weren't valuable. So I don't know that I have the best answer for this other than to say, do you find it interesting? And if you find it interesting and have value in it, then it's worth something. And there's some advice. It's helpful for me sometimes to remember that not everybody in the world is an icon designer. And so y'all could be, many are, but things that I do every single day that seem rote to me, that are just part of my process, I don't give a second thought to, may not be how other folks do it. And so even just sharing those little things I think that can be very helpful. Like I have in the past shared very little clips of like how going back to that, there was a little joke on one of the outline things about Boolean groups, which was, I was using a sheep icon to explain how I created Boolean shapes. And I shared that once on Twitter, probably at this point years ago. And just people found it super interesting because like it's not the only way to create a sheep icon, but it's the way I did it. And there are little tidbits there. So anything you can do, if I think it's worth sharing if you find interest in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people are always interested in the process.
Always interested in the process, which is what we love seeing behind the scenes today on your process. And also I love how it's grounded in your experience. You're not talking about the theory of how one might go about creating icons. It's grounded in the experience of what you did and what you're doing, which is great. Okay, I'm going to move over to this question from Ash. They're asking, what tips do you have for delivering an impactful story while working under pressure or within tight time constraints? How would you determine what needs to be highlighted and what doesn't? Any thoughts there?
That is a good question. Sorry, I got distracted by this giant sticky that appeared. An impactful story. I think part of that comes from, I think it ties in with validating whether your idea is good enough, knowing some of those same things tie into whether something will have impact. If it's something relatively foreign concept to people, I think it's going to be more impactful. So like part of us thinking about what we wanted to talk about was actually doing some research into both like other video content, articles, podcasts, whatever, is there stuff out there about people having done things this way? And there wasn't that we could track down. So it seemed that was a good kind of way to figure out what might be impactful. As far as the time constraints, that was actually a huge help, having some kind of constraints, and something that helped mitigate that. Like it wasn't we were accepted and then it was nothing until config. The way that they set it up for us, and I think would be a great model for any kind of project or presentation for yourself, is to create all of these little milestones and kind of checkpoints along the way of, okay, by this stage or this time before I actually need to deliver, I want to have a rough draft done. And by this time, I want to have 50% of my content there in a general outline or this and this, and help. It's the whole maxim of like, how do you eat the elephant one bite at a time kind of a thing, of just like trying to break it down into.
I wouldn't eat an elephant, Noah. Don't do that.
Have you tried?
Don't do it.
But if you were, you do it one.
Yes. So yeah, like using those constraints to your benefit and even layering some more on top of that to break it into digestible chunks. By this stage, I only need to have an outline. And by this stage, I only need to have part of my content there can still be super rough, and that can take a ton of pressure off. Do you want to add anything to that, Jory?
I'm still caught up on the elephant comment. Yeah, no, I don't have a ton to add. I could talk about anything for a while. I just think that just backing up, I think that I submitted to config the year before, and I was way too broad. I was talking about everything icon design related. I was like, here's this huge icon design. Let's talk. I know stuff about icon design. And it wasn't until I was like, oh, here's just this little bit unique thing that we do with icon design that may be different than other folks do. And I know it's different because I didn't used to do it. And so we developed this process together, Noah and I, and how to do it in Figma. And this might be interesting to folks. And then from that, we were able to inject stories and ideas that related to other things outside of it.
Yeah, great advice. So it's, as much as you can, try to lean into those constraints. And you talked about that, Jory, earlier too, when you talked about talking it for 40 minutes seems like a lot, but if you break it down, and just like you're saying, Noah, same thing with the timeline of getting on stage seems like a lot, but if I can just do an outline by tomorrow and then just get a draft and then just get the visual, you break it down, it feels a lot more digestible.
Yep.
Great. We're going to go to our next question around working solo. You two had the benefit of collaborating on this presentation, or you mentioned how beneficial that was in the process. Do you have any advice for someone who's working solo and doesn't have that kind of collaborative aspect built in? Any tips for things that they might be able to do to still accomplish get some of those benefits that you realize by collaborating?
Yeah, I think this whole process works if you're by yourself as well. I'll say that the sketching or the note-taking phase where you'll notice that's just my handwriting. Like I went off and did that by myself. And that was part of that was to where we were in the process. So I have done a process very similar to this by myself when I'm working on different projects. And I think that what's helpful is actually identifying and knowing where you are in the process, at what point of the process you are, and just trying to live there. And that can be hard, especially for designer, because I want to get to the problem solving. I want to get to the end result. I have all these ideas that I want to see realized. But if I can take a step back and say, this is the brainstorming, this is the wonder and invention part of the process. Anything is possible right now. I don't actually thinking about details isn't helpful here. So this part of the process is to do this. And then on the flip side, we actually have to get this FigJam document ready for this presentation today. Now I just got to get stuff out. I got to get stuff out. Let's do it. Let's make sure everything's there. Let's double check that my notes are correct. Noah and I were both in our file futzing around at things like until the very last second, to be completely honest.
Again, lean into those constraints. Yeah. And I took a note to find your Miggy here, someone who can give you feedback along the way. And it might not have to be a collaborator that you're working with that has anything to do with the presentation. It can be a friend. It can be someone that you've seen in the space. It can be a mentor. Find your Miggy, whoever that is.
It can even be beneficial to have somebody who has no idea what you're talking about, because then you can make sure it makes sense and it's accessible. You're not using jargon or anything like that to somebody who's totally fresh to the subject.
I shared the config presentation with my mom, and she said, "Oh, now I get what you do."
It's a win-win.
Yeah, it's only been years, but yes, this is what I do. That's what an icon is, Mom.
Your kids, whoever it is that you can present to. We're going to go over to a similar question that if you're presenting solo or presenting in general, this person, Julia, has trouble rambling when presenting. How do you think about your pacing and also just think about your stage presence when you're presenting?
Sure. I know Jory has much he could say on rambling aptly, but for myself, I'm also apt to do that when I haven't written enough notes, weirdly enough. Like earlier in my stage, I tend to almost script myself out completely. This is just what works for me, just to make sure I'm not like leaving any gaps in what I want to say. And once I have rehearsed that a little bit and get a feel for it, then I strip it down to something more digestible, like bullet points. But for myself, that has helped me to make sure that what I want to say will both be timely and won't get away from me. But yeah, also that I'm not leaving any gaps in what I want to say that I'll have to try to backpedal or circle back to. But I'll let Jory speak to this.
Yeah, I ramble a lot. So I will say that there's a very simple answer to this one, and that is just rehearsal. It's just rehearsal. And the recording part of it is nice because you can rewatch yourself. You can identify areas that you're rambling. And sometimes the rambling, to be completely honest, I'm doing it right now, the rambling can come up with solid gold. And so if you are recording yourself when you're rambling, you might find things that trump what you were planning on saying and take their place. Yeah. But no, it was rehearsal. It was us, Noah and I, going over it over and over. And that, like I said in the presentation here, that was scary at first. And I have a theater background. Like I do performing, and I just know that if you're confident in what you're saying and you've practiced it enough, there's no trick. It's preparation and rehearsal. You just got to go through it and know what you're going to say.
Yeah. Love that. We have time for a few more questions, and we have some popular ones. I want to go on the opposite side of that, of like when you're sending these looms to Noah or someone is asking you for their feedback, how do you think about the feedback you're providing without affecting their creative process? So what types of feedback would you give to one another that felt most useful?
Usually it would be content related. I rarely gave Noah notes on rocking back and forth because he picked up on that. Like he knew he was doing that. Although you did it less. I think you did it more when you were standing up in person when Miggy was in the room. You didn't really doing it when you were recording.
True.
Excuse me. Yeah, I don't know. Just remember that people are human. And I think I try and at least note the parts that I love as well, if not more. I know from experience that one negative comment, however well-meaning, can have so much more impact than two positive ones, just because how we're wired.
Yeah.
So we're just supportive and we're helping each other. And I think that goes into presenting, it goes into writing things, it goes into auditioning for things, and just thinking that on the other side of the table, people want you to succeed, maybe outside of Twitter comments, people want you to succeed. They're rooting for you. They want to come to a presentation to learn something, to be entertained. They don't want to come to something to be disappointed. So like they're on your side. If you're leaving a comment and you're on someone's side, that's half the battle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And feedback too it is a two-way street. It's not just like somebody dumping comments on you. As like part of the process, it can be beneficial to call out the things you're unsure about or be like, I would really love your input on this specifically to help spark some of those ideas and be like, oh, since you asked specifically, and they'll know that the person will be more receptive to that if you really put intention into the things they ask about specifically. But
yeah, great way to guide the feedback. Awesome. We have a question from Joseph about how much time you would estimate for this level of effort. So how do you think about estimating the amount of time you'll need to prepare for something like this versus something that's maybe a little smaller scale?
Noah, for this particular presentation, the one we are in the midst of right now, to be completely meta, we had the benefit of walking through a process we had already done. So like the work was already done there, but it's going to sound bad. We didn't put in a ton of time for this. Like we spent enough time, and honestly, I wish I'd put in some more time, but we've got day jobs and we're running a company and we've got other stuff to do and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The config one, we put in a lot of time. Like we put in a lot of time because we knew a lot of people were going to see it. We knew the stakes were higher.
Yeah.
But there was also a schedule built in. So we knew that on this date, we were going to be doing a dry run, or on this date, we were supposed to have our outline finished. And so whatever it took to get to those points, and I don't know, this is a fudgy answer because it depends on the process and depends where you are. And I'd say put in as much time as you need to feel comfortable, or maybe just shy of comfortable, because you'll probably never truly be comfortable. I said before this talk that he was a little nervous, and to me, I always get nervous before talks. I always get nervous before being on stage, and it's helpful for me to tell myself or remind myself like those nerves are your body preparing you to do something cool, to present something. It's giving you the energy and the adrenaline and the capability to sit in a room with hundreds of people and just talk, which you're right to be nervous. That's okay. But if you reframe it as energy, I think that can be helpful.
Yeah, that's great. One of our favorite sayings on the advocacy team is, it depends, because it does. It depends. It depends what your audience is, what your goal is. But at the end of the day, to Jory's point, you are storytelling. So be conscious of your audience and how you're showing up to tell that story, and then do what you feel like you need to prepare to bring your best self to that.
And just eat that elephant one bite at a time.
Eat that.
Yum.
Yes. This one got a lot of likes here. So we're going to end on this about tools. So we talked about Figma, FigJam, Loom, Keynote, screen recording. Any other tools that you would recommend that you bring into your storytelling process, or anything else that you would recommend to the group to check out in terms of their storytelling practices?
So the glasses falling on George Boole, that was just Keynote. I had a little clip art of the glasses, and I had the George Boole picture, and Keynote has animations built in. So I just use Keynote for that.
Okay. So making the most of the features and functionality in the tool. Anything else? Anything you would call out? Maybe some icons and font also?
Yeah, definitely use icons from Font Awesome in all of your projects. So
we do have hundreds for free.
Yay.
They're out
Great
there.
plug there. And let's go to our closing section here. That's a great segue here. So Jory and Noah have talked about how you can use FigJam and Figma for presentations like this. But also, we would love for you to check out Jory and Noah's Config Talk. So go check that out. It's on YouTube. You can watch it right from here, or search on YouTube for that. We do have other future live streams coming up at figma.com/events. So you can check those out and register there. And you can always send us other ideas of other talks you'd like to see. I am also working on meeting folks who are using Figma and FigJam for storytelling and their meetings. So if you are doing that and want to talk to me, please connect. You can connect with me on LinkedIn or at kchambers@figma.com. With that, again, we will send the recording of this session tomorrow, and you can expect that and the files that we shared and looked at together today. With that, I want to send a huge thank you, Jory and Noah, to you both for being open to telling your story, for pulling back the curtain and letting us see the magic that went into your presentation, all the beauty that it is, and sharing all of these tips and answering our questions today. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you everyone for joining us. We really appreciate you being here and spending this hour with us. And we hope to see you again soon. Happy jamming.